Glaciers hold centuries-old secrets imprinted in layers of ancient ice. But they also have another side. They collect their tribute from those who dare to challenge them. Ted Porter's story is the tale of a man who paid that tribute and, against all odds, came back to tell it. Glacier National Park is a majestic natural monument spread out in northwestern Montana on the Canadian border. More than 1 million acres of pristine terrain, where high mountain peaks neighbor crystal-clear lakes and ancient forests, give way to the ice fields that gave the park its name. The creation of the park in May 1910 recognized its unique natural value, which still attracts thousands of tourists each year. Jackson Glacier is one of the most impressive and dangerous glaciers in the system. Located on the northwest slope of Mount Jackson, this relatively small glacier had a footprint of only 2 square miles in 2013, a tiny shard of what covered these mountains a century ago. Its steep slopes, with gradients of 20 to 40 degrees, pose serious hazards even for experienced climbers. Under a thin layer of snow, there were numerous cracks up to several dozen feet deep, ready to swallow a careless traveler. On this day, the weather added an extra dimension of danger. The sky over Glacier was overcast with low clouds, with occasional showers of rain. Water was turning the glacier surface into a deadly slippery slope, and visibility was getting worse by the hour. Temperatures hovered around 50 degrees, warm enough to cause melting, yet cold enough that a soaked person would quickly begin to freeze. In this deceptively beautiful setting of September 2013, where ice fields meet the sky and silence is broken only by the whisper of wind and the crackling of ancient ice, one rash move set off a chain of events that turned an ordinary hike into a desperate struggle for every next breath. Ted Porter, a 36-year-old voice actor from Los Angeles, was no casual hiker in Glacier National Park. His relationship with these mountains goes back to his earliest childhood, when his parents first brought him here as an infant. Since then, the park has been an integral part of his life, a place where his character, values, and love of nature were formed. Ted's connection to Glacier wasn't just emotional, it was almost familial. He worked at the Mini Glacier Hotel in his youth, then attended the University of Montana. For a kid from Kansas City who grew up among the plains, Montana's mountains became a second home, where every trail, every river bend, and every pass was familiar to the smallest detail. "I know Glacier like my own backyard," Ted often told friends, and there was no exaggeration in that. Tall, with an athletic build and a confident gaze, Ted exuded the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to relying on himself. His knowledge of mountain survival was not superficial. Years of hiking had taught him how to read the weather, find trails, and deal with the unexpected. Perhaps it was this confidence that was his weakness, the line that thinly separates experience from complacency. Family camping trips to Glacier were a sacred tradition for the Porters. Every summer or every other year, they would come here, camp by one of the many lakes, and explore the park. Ted's father, who once worked at the same Mini Glacier Hotel, passed on to his son not only a love of these places, but also a respect for their unpredictable character. Over the years, however, Ted began to crave the more challenging trails, the corners of the park where ordinary hikers didn't wander. In September 2013, after a week spent with his parents on relatively easy trails, Ted felt the familiar call of the mountains. His parents flew back to Kansas City, and he decided to stay a few days to fulfill a longtime dream of climbing Mount Jackson and hiking its famous glacier. It was a route he had heard and read about, but had never dared to take in the company of his family. The morning of September 2, 2013, greeted Glacier with low clouds and drizzling rain. Ted Porter woke up in his hotel room near the park, looked out the window at the gray sky, and for a moment hesitated in his plans. The weather wasn't ideal for climbing, but it wasn't bad enough to cancel the hike. After all, that's what he'd come here for, to conquer Jackson Glacier. Methodically packing his backpack, Ted went by the mental checklist of a seasoned hiker. A fleece jacket and raincoat, gloves, hat, spare socks, anything to stay warm and dry, a gallon of water and a couple of energy bars, enough for a day hike, flashlight, map, compass, bear spray for safety, and of course, an ice axe and crampons, essential glacier gear. Light kit for a day hike, he muttered to himself as he tightened the straps of his backpack. The backpack was compact, but contained everything he needed for the planned route. Ted left early, and by 11 a.m. he was on the trail. The rain continued to drizzle, turning the ground into slippery mud. The trail to Jackson Glacier started at Going to the Sun Road and first led through the woods to Gunsight Lake. Ted walked quickly, enjoying the solitude and silence. After spending a week with his parents, he appreciated being alone with nature, moving at his own pace, stopping only where he wanted to. "I felt fantastic and was in good shape," he later recalled. Despite the late start and the rain, Ted was hurrying, making up time. The forest around him grew thinner, revealing views of majestic mountain peaks framed by low clouds. After 2 hours of fast walking, Ted reached Gunsight Lake and the turnoff to the trailhead for Jackson Glacier. He stopped, checking the map. The signpost at the turn was barely visible, a faded wooden post that could easily have been missed. The trail went upward, winding between rocks and sparse shrubs. Here it was no longer as well marked as the main hiking route. The last miles to the glacier became a real challenge. The trail became an eroded, muddy lane, disappearing among the rocks in places. Ted noticed fresh bear scat, a reminder that he wasn't the only inhabitant here. He checked to see if he could easily get bear spray out of his backpack's side pocket and moved on. Suddenly, rounding a rocky ledge, Ted encountered a group of hikers descending. In this wilderness, where he hadn't expected to meet anyone, the appearance of people came as a surprise. "Be careful," warned one of them, a man in a red jacket. "It's very slippery up there. It's just been raining." Ted nodded, grateful for the warning, but inwardly brushed off the advice. He was young, confident in his abilities, and knew these places well. In the back of his mind, he even thought that these hikers were probably just not experienced enough for the challenging conditions. This was the first of a chain of mistakes that would soon put his life in jeopardy. As he continued to climb, Ted didn't realize that the warning was not just a polite tourist exchange of information, but critical advice that he had ignored due to his own complacency. Soon, Ted found himself halfway up the north side of Mount Jackson. The trail disappeared, and he climbed steep scree until he finally reached the foot of the glacier. The view was breathtaking. The Jackson Glacier spread out before him, covering the north slope of the mountain. The snowy surface resembled a frozen sea going toward the summit, which towered another 3,000 feet above him. The sun peeked out briefly, making the glacier glisten, but Ted's experienced eye recognized more than beauty. It noted faults that could be deep crevasses. Putting on his crampons, Ted began his ascent up the glacier. Halfway up, he noticed a rocky ridge and decided to change his route. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He had to be back before dark. However, the weather was rapidly deteriorating. The rain made the rocks slippery, and at one point Ted almost fell off, only to miraculously regain his balance. His heart was pounding with adrenaline. That moment was the signal that further climbing was becoming too dangerous. "I've got to go back," he decided as he took one last look at the peak, hidden in the clouds. Ted evaluated 2 possible ways to descend: back up the slippery rocks or down the glacier at its steepest point. After deliberation, he chose the glacier. It seemed faster, and despite the steepness, Ted was confident in his abilities. He looked down the slope below him. The slope started gently, then became steeper, but the snow looked deep enough. There were crampons in his backpack, but setting them up would take time. The clouds were thickening, and there was less and less daylight. "I've done this before," Ted thought. "I'll just go down faster." That thought was a turning point. A change from a normal hike to a fight for survival in one of the most dangerous places in Glacier National Park. Ted decided to leave the cats in his backpack. He cast one last glance at the glacier slope below. The gradient seemed manageable, gentle at first, then getting steeper, but the layer of snow looked thick enough to provide good traction. He checked his backpack straps, tightened his bootlaces, and clutching his trekking poles in his hands, stepped onto the glacier. The disaster was instantaneous. Beneath the thin layer of snow was ice as hard as stone. Ted's feet lost their footing, and he fell on his back. The next second, his body was an uncontrollable sled sliding down the icy slope. Panic came in waves. Ted tried desperately to slow his descent by thrusting his sticks into the glacier surface, but their tips slid powerlessly across the ice. With each passing second, he picked up speed, turning what had begun as a controlled descent into a relentless tumble. Ted tried to dig his boot heels into the ice, clinging to the frozen slope with his bare hands, all to no avail. Cold splashes of ice and snow slammed into his face, temporarily blinding him. Through the moisture in his eyes, he tried to see where his inertia was carrying him. Ahead, right in the path of his uncontrolled slide, was a gaping crack in the glacier. Wide and dark, it seemed to open its jaws, ready to swallow him. Ted had no chance to change the trajectory of his movement. He was doomed to fly straight into the rift. The world around him was moving at a dizzying speed, but Ted's perception was strangely slowed. His thoughts became crystal clear. My God, I'm going to die. In a last desperate impulse, Ted decided to try to jump over the crack. If he pushed off the ice with his feet at the very edge of the rift, he might be able to fly over the abyss. He waited until the last possible moment, then pushed off with all the strength he could muster. The jump failed. Instead of flying over the crack, Ted crashed violently into its front wall. The last thing he felt was the moment he fell deep into the icy chasm. Consciousness returned to Ted slowly. First came the sensation of cold, penetrating to the bone, then the realization that he was lying on something hard and wet. Finally, he dared to open his eyes. Darkness enveloped him. Only a thin strip of light from above made it possible to distinguish the outline of the cleft. Ted was lying on a rock ledge at the bottom of the crevasse, about 30 feet from the surface of the glacier. His backpack was still on him, probably to cushion the impact of the fall. Ted tried to assess his position. All around him were smooth walls of ice rising upward toward a distant clearing in the sky. He tried to move, and at that moment a piercing pain shot up his back. The pain was so intense that for a moment white spots flashed before his eyes. When the first wave of agony receded, Ted did what he had been afraid to do. He tried to move his legs. Nothing. Not the slightest movement. Panic struck with renewed force when he realized he couldn't feel anything below his waist. The impact had probably damaged his spine, and now he couldn't move. Ted looked up at the narrow strip of sky, so distant and unreachable. The temperature in the crevasse was much lower than on the surface, no more than a few degrees above zero. The cold was already creeping under his clothes, making his teeth chatter involuntarily. In desperation, Ted fumbled for his cell phone in his pocket. With trembling fingers, he unlocked the screen, but hope faded as soon as he saw the absence of a network signal. No one knew where he was. It was getting colder by the minute, and Ted realized that even if he survived the trauma, the cold would kill him in a matter of hours. In this moment of utter hopelessness, Ted opened the camera app. If he was destined to die here, he wanted to leave one last message to his parents. With a trembling hand, he turned on the recording, and through the coming tears, he spoke. I fell into a crevasse. My back. Hurts a lot. I'm still alive. Still alive. If I don't get out, I love you. I'm not kidding. This is not a joke. Ted finished the tape. For a minute, he just lay there, resigned to the thought of the end. But then something changed. First, he felt a slight tingling in his legs, then a dull ache. Slowly but surely, sensation returned to his lower body. Suddenly, all thoughts of death receded. A fierce determination to survive flared up inside. Ted didn't want to die in that icy grave. He didn't want the rescuers to find his stiffened body. If there was still the slightest chance of getting out, he had to take it. With great effort, Ted took off his backpack and pulled out a fleece jacket. He pulled it on over his already wet clothes, then pulled out his crampons and ice axe, the last tools he had to lean on. There was no choice. There was only one way up. The pain in his back was tearing, but since he could feel his legs, there was still hope. Slowly, overcoming the pain, Ted rolled over and tried to stand up. He leaned on his ice axe and straightened up as far as his injury would allow. Every movement resonated with a flash of agony, but he forced himself to move, searching the walls of the crevasse for a way out. And then came the terrible realization. He was not at the bottom, but on a ledge. Below was a gaping blackness, another abyss. One step to the side, and it could have ended differently. He looked at the walls. One was steep and overhanging, impossible to climb. The other was steep, but at an angle of about 40 degrees, and there were bumps to grab onto. When he reached it, he put on his crampons, drove his teeth into the ice, then hammered his ice axe above his head. The metal rattled into the hard surface. Climbing seemed insane. No insurance, no second ice axe, no experience in ice climbing, and most importantly, a damaged spine where any movement could be the last. But to stay meant one thing: to freeze. So Ted began the ascent, inch by inch, digging into the crampons, pulling himself up on the ice axe, clinging to barely visible bumps with his frozen fingers. The strategy was extremely simple. Lift himself a few inches each time, then rest with his face and body pressed against the icy wall. Several times Ted was on the verge of a breakdown. The crampons slipped. The ice axe failed to find a reliable footing. At such times, only the instinct of self-preservation and a desperate desire to live kept him going. Minute by minute, inch by inch, Ted climbed toward the light. The icy wall, which from below seemed insurmountable, gradually gave way under his persistence. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Ted's ice axe dug into the edge of the crack. With a last, desperate effort, he pulled himself up and over the edge, climbing out of the ice trap. Ted lay on his stomach, sprawled on the surface of the glacier. His body was shaking uncontrollably, partly from the cold, partly from adrenaline and exhaustion. Nearby gaped the black maw of the crevasse that had nearly become his grave. Now that Ted was on the surface, the temperature seemed almost warm compared to the icy cold of the crack, but he couldn't afford to rest. Thanks to his perseverance, he had spent no more than 40 minutes in the crevasse, but it was enough to put him on the verge of hypothermia. Ted realized with horror that he was lying on a narrow snow bridge between the crevasse he had just climbed out of and another crevasse right next to it. One careless shift of weight and he could fall again. Gritting his teeth, Ted began to crawl slowly, advancing like a caterpillar, using his ice axe as an anchor. Gathering the last of his strength, Ted pushed himself off the snow and struggled to his feet. Leaning heavily on the ice axe, he began a slow, agonizing descent down the glacier. When he finally reached the bottom of the glacier, he realized that his ordeal was just beginning. He now had to hike 3 miles through rocky terrain to Gansite Lake, where he hoped to find people. The trail he had climbed briskly in the morning now became an agonizing obstacle course. It narrowed, became slippery from the rain, looped between boulders. At one point, Ted lost his balance and collapsed to the ground, writhing in unbearable pain. After lying there for a few minutes, he remembered the danger of falling prey to a predator. In the morning, he had seen fresh bear tracks. With inhuman effort, Ted forced himself up. Now he moved with extreme caution, holding an ice axe in one hand and a can of bear spray in the other. By 5 o'clock in the evening, Ted finally emerged from the woods into the open meadow surrounding Gansite Lake. He prayed there were people here. Rounding the last bend in the trail, Ted saw them 2 hikers sitting on a large boulder at the water's edge. Gathering the rest of his strength, he headed toward them. Noticing his uncertain, stumbling gait, the hikers stood up. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, looking anxiously at Ted's pale, haggard face. "I fell into a crevasse on the Jackson Glacier," answered Ted, and these simple words, spoken with difficulty, opened the way to his salvation. A group of hikers quickly gathered around Ted. The disbelief in their eyes was replaced by anxiety as they realized the seriousness of the situation. Among them were people with a basic knowledge of first aid. They gently laid Ted on an air mattress, wrapped him in sleeping bags, and pulled dry socks over his frozen feet. A woman named Janet took over Ted's care, urging him to remain still as they could not determine the severity of his injury. Someone handed him paracetamol tablets and a bottle of water. Despite the throbbing pain in his back with every breath, the sense of human presence brought a strange calmness. For the first time in this endless day, Ted allowed himself to close his eyes. Dusk was rapidly thickening, and the hikers were discussing a plan of action. Disagreements arose. Some suggested going immediately for help, while others pointed out the dangers of traveling through bear territory at night. When the hikers turned to Ted for advice, he, feeling a little better in a stationary position and not realizing the severity of his injuries, suggested waiting until morning. The thought of ruining someone else's hike depressed him as much as the physical pain. The group decided that 2 of the hikers would go to the rangers at dawn, and the others would stay with Ted to keep him warm and monitor his condition. As darkness fell, the campers dispersed to their tents. Ted's back had completely stiffened by then, making it impossible for him to make even the slightest movement without excruciating pain. He spent the night under the open sky, looking up at the stars and fighting the feeling that time had stopped. Checking his watch became an agonizing ritual. What seemed like an hour or 2 actually turned out to be measly minutes. The only consolation was the presence of Janet, who periodically checked on his condition, adjusted his sleeping bags, and simply held his hand, distracting him with conversation. There was a human warmth in her voice and gestures that Ted would never forget. The first bird trills and the faint glow of dawn brought relief. The camp began to move. 2 campers went off as planned to find help, and Janet remained seated next to Ted, continuing to distract him from the growing pain with talk of everyday things. Around 10 in the morning, the distinctive sound of helicopter blades was heard in the distance. The hikers who had left to get help met a ranger at the foot of the trail, who immediately called for an air ambulance. Moments later, 2 paramedics in bright red jackets were at Ted's side. After a brief examination, they administered synthetic morphine for pain relief and, with the help of the hikers, carefully moved him onto a stretcher. Over the radio, the medics reported a suspected serious spinal injury and the need for immediate evacuation. Ted had time to cast one last look at the hikers who had saved him, especially at Janet. Words of gratitude stuck in his dry throat, but she seemed to understand him without words. The stretcher was lifted and the rescuers carried Ted to the waiting helicopter. He was loaded, strapped in, and the machine lifted off the ground, gaining altitude over the majestic expanse of Glacier National Park. The flight to Kalispell Regional Medical Center took about half an hour. The medics stayed by Ted's side the entire time, monitoring his condition and keeping him talking so he wouldn't pass out. He noted that Ted was incredibly lucky, as many people don't make it out of situations like this. The helicopter landed on the hospital grounds, where a medical team was already waiting for Ted. He was quickly moved to the emergency room for initial tests and x-rays. In the emergency room, doctors performed a series of tests. The results showed that Ted had suffered a severe tear fracture of his L2 vertebrae, caused by a severe impact from the fall. Of particular concern was a bone fragment that was only 2 millimeters from the spinal cord and threatened complete paralysis. Ted had time to talk briefly with his parents on the phone, but the conversation was interrupted when the doctors announced the need for emergency surgery. The anesthesiologist was already preparing him for transfer to the operating room, explaining that the bone fragment was pressing on the spinal cord like a spear point, and if it penetrated the spinal cord sheath, partial or complete paralysis was possible. After waking up from surgery, Ted learned that the intervention had gone according to plan. The surgeons placed 2 rods and 8 screws to secure the spine, fusing 3 vertebrae together to provide stability. The days that followed merged for Ted into a hazy succession of painkillers, doctor's visits, and brief conversations with concerned parents. After a few days of immobile recovery, the rehabilitation program began. Time was a critical factor in regaining mobility. The medical staff helped Ted relearn walking by supporting muscle memory. After a week, he was discharged from the hospital and flew to his parents' home to continue his recovery. Despite the successful surgery and physical therapy, Ted had to accept a new reality. His life had changed forever. A spinal fracture was not the kind of injury that could be reversed without consequences. In the months and years that followed, Ted devoted himself to various methods of recovery: physical therapy, acupuncture, yoga, meditation. He tried both medication and holistic approaches. Against all odds, he refused to let trauma define the boundaries of his life. Constant pain complicated the ability to enjoy life as before, but that didn't stop Ted from returning to activity. He went to the gym regularly, planned new, safer routes, and treasured each moment with renewed intensity. His story became an example of what can be achieved even after the most serious injury. The nightmares in which Ted fell into an endless ice crevasse over and over again became less frequent over time. He learned to get out, if not from the crack itself, then from the shadow it cast on his life. 5 years later, standing at the foot of Jackson Glacier, Ted felt a familiar throbbing in his back, an ever-present reminder of that day. But now it was also a symbol of his victory over fear, over the elements, over his own limitations. Not everything in life is under human control, but you can always choose to face what fate sends. Ted Porter climbed out of the crack. He overcame nature, pain, and his own self-confidence. But did he survive in the full sense of the word? Because sometimes the crack remains not in the ice, but inside us. Who's to blame for this story? Self-confidence, the elements, or ordinary human recklessness? Write in the comments. What do you think? What would you do if you were Ted? Or maybe something like this has already happened to you. If you like this story, be sure to put a like and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories about courage, strength of spirit, and the greatness of wildlife ahead of us. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next episodes.